Hello, and welcome to the RIOT IQ Podcast. This is a podcast designed to provide news and information about some of the most interesting and latest research on intelligence. And today my guest is Ivan Kroupin, who is the lead author on an interesting article published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences called The Cultural Construction of Executive Function. And this is an open access article that anyone can visit. And so if you want to read it all for yourself, you can click the link that we'll share, and without any sort of paywall, you can read it and all the supplementary details. And there's a lot of interesting information there that we're not going to be able to get to today. But I appreciate you for coming on, Ivan, and being willing to talk about the study.
Sure. Happy to be here.
First of all, tell me about yourself and a little bit about your background so we can get to know you.
Sure. So I'm a cross-cultural cognitive scientist, I guess is the best term for whatever set of fields I overlap. I've recently moved to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology as a researcher, formerly at the London School of Economics, and before that at Harvard for PhD and postdoc. And I also co-direct a field site in Namibia, on the border of Namibia and Angola, along with Professor Helen Davis. So that's kind of my two-sentence overview.
Excellent. How'd you get interested in cross-cultural psychology?
Good question. I mean, there's certainly an element of me searching this. I'm a third culture kid. I grew up in a Russian household in Minnesota. So there's an element of that, but intellectually, it was a long journey from starting my bachelor's in philosophy, then kind of getting interested in actually asking the bigger questions more concretely, then moving through a PhD in developmental psychology, which wasn't cross-cultural, but starting to read cross-cultural literature, and then shifting a postdoc to suddenly working at and then quickly managing a field site. So in some sense was always going to do cross-cultural work, but also sort of stumbled into it.
I see. Tell me about what managing a field site entails. I think that most of our audience does not know what that means.
Yeah, well, neither did I till I started. So yeah, it's a lot of stuff that you don't get taught in PhD. I mean, the working in the field is fantastic for all sorts of reasons. I mean, there's obviously the data, right, which we're going to get to. But also it brings you much closer to this real phenomena of cognition in some sense. Like I did a PhD at Harvard in developmental psychology and really never spoke to a child outside of an experimental context. Like I didn't interact with how Boston children lived. I didn't interact. I mean, and this is no flaw of the program, right? I had a wonderful program, an excellent advisor. But just the way that, psychology is structured tends to put us in ivory towers to some extent. And in the field, you have to see this stuff and you have to engage with it. And you have to engage with the realities. Like if you're going to work in a school, you have to deal with not only the school, but the school management and what that's like and the conditions under which people are living, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? When you work out in the villages, you have to live in a tent out with the way that they live, right? So it brings you closer to the way that cognition works in the wild. I think that's something that's super important, but it also, all the attendant challenges, right? Figuring out how to bring water out in a truck to a remote location, or fix punctures, or build your own bridge when there's the road is worn out or whatever. There's a lot of stuff going on there.
Yeah. The ivory tower would not prepare you for literal bridge building while you're also building bridges with communities. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So tell me about the study. Can you give us a synopsis of what the study was designed to discover, what sort of data you collected, and then what you found in it?
Sure. So the study has a sort of unusual logic to it, in the sense that usually when we're trying to measure some general cognitive capacity somewhere that's in a population that's not typical for cognitive science, we try to adapt our tests. We do all sort of pre-testing to make new tests to like figure out how we should be testing some local capacity to measure, and the goal being to measure that capacity in the local region. What I and my co-authors were interested in was not that. What we were interested in is, what is it that the standard test that we've been using forever, right? And for those who are not closely familiar with the executive function literature, it's enormous and it's extremely reliant on standard measures of executive function, right? Of which there are a large number, but there's like a cluster that are super highly used, right? And so the question was, okay, so we use these tests to measure something, but what is it that we're measuring? To what extent should we be confident that these tests are measuring an underlying universal capacity? And to what extent might it be the case that what the tests are measuring is a construct that captures also a particular type of cultural experience? Now, that particular type of cultural experience is formal schooling, like the exposure to schooling, or more broadly, exposure to worlds where schooling is like central to our lives, right? So we not only do we go to school, we're raised by school parents, our jobs depend on school performance and school-like skills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So our societies are permeated by formal schooling, as are most societies in the world, right? Even in developing countries, like urban areas, that's also super school-centered. And yet schools emerged in like something like the last 0.2% of human history. And there's 700 million people who are illiterate to this day. So it's not like these are typical environments. So the question is, these tests that are designed in these schooled environments and look quite a lot like school tests, are they actually measuring an underlying universal, or are they or is there an extent to which they may be measuring something that's specific to the experience of schooling in schooled worlds? And so what we did was bring these tests exactly as they are into environments where participants have a varying exposure to formal schooling. So what we did is make as few changes as possible to the tests so that they just be intelligible to the participants. We have all sorts of checks in the paper. You can go read the details about making sure that participants understood what was going on. I mean, that's super important. But otherwise, the tests are intact. And the question is, are we going to see, how much of a difference are we going to see, and what is the size of the difference going to suggest in terms of whether these are universal capacities or not, right? Mm-hmm. So if we see like small differences or big convergence, then there's some reason to think that these tests are measuring the same thing across populations. But if the differences are enormous, like much larger than you could interpret as just differences in cultural exposure, or like larger than you could interpret as differences in an underlying universal capacity, then we have reason to suspect that these tests are measuring different things. They're not measuring universal capacity so much as they're measuring a culturally specific capacity related to schooling and schooled worlds. So that's the kind of unusual logic of the setup, but the setup is actually quite simple in the sense that we brought the test there and we ran it with this series of populations.
No, and I see a lot of commonalities between what you're talking about and how we do cross-cultural measures in intelligence. Just like executive functioning, we have a wide variety of tasks or subtests or whatever you want to call it that we use to measure intelligence. And, it's a legitimate question. Okay, this task developed by Westerners for an industrialized Western society. How does it function when we take it elsewhere? Because if you don't ask, as you said, for example, before, if you don't ask, do my examinees understand the instructions? Do they understand the task? And if the answer is no, regardless of the reason why, then any score comparisons you make don't make sense. You have me take a test in Vietnamese, a language that I don't speak a lick of, and I score very poorly in it. That doesn't mean I'm stupid or that I have poor executive functioning. We have to make sure that these tasks function correctly across cultures and ask that measurement question before we even get into the question of, okay, what do these differences mean or why might they appear?
I think that's right. I mean, to my mind, there's also a more conceptual question, which has to do with the question of what we're measuring. So with executive function, you can say that there's kind of two things. What is executive function, right? If we take a step back, what is executive function? Well, first, broadly speaking, for those who might not be familiar, right, it's the capacity to top down control over emotional regulation, planning, decision making, this kind of thing, right? So control of your emotion and cognition. There's this general definition of executive function, which has to be universal. Like everybody needs some sort of top-down control of their emotion, their cognition, the ability to form plans, et cetera, right? It's just clearly the case. And any animal with a brain is going to have something like executive function in this sense. So that's the first one. There's a second executive function. And the second executive function is the overlap in performance between executive function tests that's been derived as a construct. Right? So famously by Miyake and Friedman, but people have done this, a million different times. Now, people tend to just assume that the two things are the same. But that's not necessarily clear, right? Because there's a confound in the sense that all of the tests that have been run, and we review this in the paper, all of the tests that have been run in societies where people go to schools, right? All of them. And so if you have everybody going to school and then you have a construct that has a common factor between tests, the question is this common, to what extent is this common factor this underlying universal capacity, right? Executive function 1, let's call it. And to what extent is it capturing this common skills that are developed through the experience of schooling, right? I mean, if we sent all our kids to ballet class, all of them, right, and spent trillions of dollars every year sending everybody to ballet class, and then we tried to investigate human bipedal development by measuring how people do pirouettes, in our samples, perfectly normal developmental curves, but this doesn't mean that doesn't mean that doing pirouettes is a natural ability. So it's got that kind of logic to it.
No, and we're very much approaching the same question from two different perspectives. You from the executive function perspective, me from the intelligence perspective. Although I will say, to my field's credit, there are research studies from intelligence about using these tests going back almost 100 years in non-Western cultures. That doesn't mean that the studies that old are very good. It doesn't mean the modern ones are very good necessarily. But, there has been this recognition in the intelligence field of school is an evolutionary novel environment. As you said, for 99.8% of human history, there wasn't such a thing as school. And even today, it's not universal. And so I do agree with you that there's value in disentangling the universal component that there has to be. There has to be some sort of way to control your attention. If not, you would never be able to hunt game, gather food, because you would be constantly distracted by that new, that rock falling over there, that sound that your hunting companion made, if you're in a cave environment. But you're right. Are we measuring just the cultural manifestations of those things, which have been highly influenced by school, or not? And so I think your paper, and that's why it caught my attention, it asks a very theoretically useful and interesting question, but also a very practical one too. If we are going to understand people and our friends from non-Western cultures and from cultures where schooling's not very common, let's make sure we have instruments that get at their abilities and not just, oh, how much have you gone to school? We know how much they went to school. They can tell us.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it. Yeah, sorry, just to quickly follow up. I think that's right, and I think that it's not only for our understanding of folks who haven't gone to school, who live in different environments. We are a little bit in the position of, I mean, for the fans of Douglas Adams out there, this is like, there's this passage in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where famously a supercomputer is asked the meaning of life and it returns the answer 42. And then the people who built this, well, the mice technically, but the individuals who built the supercomputer are like, what does that mean? And the supercomputer tells them, well, I'm not sure that you knew what the question was. And so I think that's also the situation here. Not only are we not sure exactly how to measure executive function in non-schooled populations. In schooled populations, having used standard tests, we've conflated exposure to schooling with the development of universal capacity. So we're a little bit like, okay, our developmental data on executive function is super important, is related to schooling outcomes. These tests are valuable in all sorts of ways, but they're a little bit 42, right? We're not sure what we've been asking. Have we been asking how well kids have developed school abilities? Or have we been asking how well kids have developed universal executive function? Or what's the mix of the two, et cetera, right? So here we're trying to like prize them apart a little bit.
And to do that, you collected data from the UK, from the 𝐶𝐿 people in the Bolivian rainforest, which have been the topic of a lot of studies in cognitive development. And then also the Himba, Twa, and Zemba peoples. And tell us a little bit about them, because you've had a lot of first-hand exposure to them, I presume.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I collected I was there for the collection of every data point in the study. The setup was usually there's a local RA who's doing the talking to the child, and then I'm recording things on the tablet. So the 𝐶𝐿𝐒 are a forager horticulturalist population in the Bolivian Amazon. And then the Himba, Twa, and Zemba are closely related set of Bantu groups, pastoralist groups, who live broadly in many places, but the places we worked were the north of Namibia and southern Angola.
Okay, and of course also British children. What sort of tasks did you give to these people in order to measure their executive functioning?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's more like the measure. It was a measure of the measures of executive functioning. But yes, so we gave them. There was a battery of tasks. These are super standard executive function measures drawn from. There's a canonical list that Carlson compiled. We also included verbal fluency. So we'll start with verbal fluency, since I've mentioned it. Verbal fluency is when you ask a participant, name as many animals as you can. You have 2 minutes. And it's any given category, right? So we adjusted generally animals is a great category because everybody knows animals. And the thing is that if you ever try this, it's surprisingly difficult. Like we know a ton of animals, and the kids in all societies know a ton of animals. But if you actually are asked the question, it's tricky. It's tricky to sort of like maneuver the space of your memory and top down, figure out how to get through it and name as many animals as possible. That's one task. Another pair of tasks were the forward and backward. They're called forward and backward span tasks. So what you do is you list a set of words. Typically they're digits, but we didn't use numbers because not everybody here is using numbers as much as, not everybody in this study is using numbers as much as we do. So we used common 2-syllable nouns in every language. I say whatever, chair, table, rock. And then you say chair, table, rock. And then I give you a 4-word list and you repeat a 4-word list. And then once you get that wrong twice, once you get the list wrong twice, that's your span. That's how many the words you can recall. Backward span is the same thing, except I say it forwards, you say it back to me.
Yeah, we use that a lot in intelligence research as a measure of working memory. So I'm not surprised that there's that overlap.
Yeah, super common thing. And then there was other tasks. I think that the other ones probably take a little bit more time to explain. Dimensional card sort was there as well. I encourage people to look at that one. There's more details in the paper. It's particularly interesting for some reasons, but maybe a little bit longer to explain. So yeah, battery of standard executive
the paper
tasks.
does explain pretty well, and there's great visual aids. The digital card sort is shown depicted in figure 1, for example. And like you said, they're very canonical. And so if someone sees a term that they don't understand, but they know it's one of your measures, it's not hard to Google it and say, oh, okay, this is what they did. And that's one thing I like about it, is that unlike what we sometimes do in psychology, you folks took very well validated in Western cultures instruments and use them. You didn't go off and try to make your own and try to convince the reader, oh, this newfangled question set we have, trust us, it has good reliability in this one. No, you very much built on prior work, and that makes it easier to incorporate this paper into what we already know about executive functioning, intelligence, etc. Okay, so we know who you studied, we know what you administered to them. Tell us about the findings.
Sure. So the findings are fairly striking. So in most cases, so basically the populations that we had were the UK, which is the standard science that sample, schooled population sample that we've been using cognitive sciences forever. We got the two groups from the Namibian Angolan population. One which has gone to school, kids that have gone to school in that context. Their schooling system is for rural regions reasonably good. And so we got that population who's gone to school, and then their sort of peers from the same groups who haven't gone to school at all and have no exposure to school. The Bolivian population is a little bit more of a complicated context. They're going to school, but there's, let's just say, the language barriers between the teachers and the students. So it's not totally clear how much they're learning in school. So they presented an interesting case. I'm going to set them aside. Feel free to look at the paper. The main contrasts are between UK, standard sample for cognitive science, and then the schooled Kunene is the region in Namibia, so in Angola. Kunene schooled sample, and then the Kunene unschooled sample, right? So the schooled Kunene sample, in broadly speaking, the results are showing that the schooled Kunene sample is looking like the UK sample with some delays, right? So they're much closer to the UK sample than the other two groups. Whereas the unschooled population is showing massive delays. Not delays, right? That's the wrong word. I really shouldn't use that word, right? Massive differences in the performance. Like, it's really important to say this. Like, I think the kids in Namibia are fine. Like, they're doing stuff that Boston and UK, like 4, 5, 6, 16-year-olds couldn't dream of. They're navigating like hundreds of heads of cattle through like a wasteland in their like middle school years. So they got executive function, right? They're doing okay. Specifically on the performance on these tests, we're seeing gaps of, like, for example, in dimensional card sort. It's overwhelmingly the case that kids, and this is replicated a million times, that kids in Western schooled, or just schooled, not even Western, right? Anywhere in the world, schooled populations from school saturated environments, they're passing around 4 or 5. All of them are. There's a step function. Mm-hmm. In the non-school population, you have kids who are still not showing the canonical performance on the task at age 14, 15, right? And so now this task has been described as like a measure of prefrontal cortex development. It's even in like an NIH toolbox as a measure of prefrontal cortex development, right? And it probably is in school populations, but there's just like no way in which like the 14-year-olds in Namibia who are like by that age, like hurting these huge, they have family responsibilities by that age. They've got a lot of stuff to do. They are not equivalent to like UK 4-year-olds.
It seems absurd to say a child who's capable of herding dozens, hundreds of cattle across the wasteland to get to the next pasture, the next. I'm not an expert in this area. The next watering hole or whatever. Yeah. That. Oh, they have the executive functioning of a 3 or a 4-year-old in the UK. No, that's crazy. You can't walk a half block with a 3-year-old's executive functioning without getting distracted, let alone dozens of miles while keeping track of dozens or hundreds of animals. So you're right, there has to be some sort of executive functioning. The fact that it doesn't show up on the card sort task shows that, to me, that the task is not functioning the way it does for these unschooled children as it does for children who have been to school. Is that how you would interpret that?
Yes. I mean, I think so. 2 things. One thing I would say is that, like, this is also, we happen to use this task that's super commonly used. Again, it is kind of, as you gestured towards, as an effort to translate or like connect this work with the broader audience. But consistent results with this kind of sorting and the use of like dimension switching tasks has been found for 30, 40 years in the cross-cultural literature, using tasks that are not as standard. So again, we review some of them in the paper. So it's not conceptually sort of the first time anybody's seen this. This is a really consistent result. We're showing it on dimensional card sort. What I would say in terms of interpretation of the findings, I think, again, turning the light, so to speak, back on where this task came from, to me, the question is, what are we measuring in the UK? What are we measuring in the US, right? We want to say that this is executive function, right? We have executive function 1, which is this definitely universal, everybody has it, animal, like non-human animals have it, that thing. We want to say that dimensional card sort in the UK is pointing to this, like that's what's developing, it's general prefrontal cortex developments. And what it looks like is that might not be the case, right? If it's so culturally variable, if it's showing these enormous differences as a function of cultural context, what this task might be pointed to is an executive function that's mixed in with certain cognitive skills, right? Certain like ballet is a culturally specific cognitive skill. School is going to give you culturally specific cognitive skills. And so my interpretation would be tasks like this, results like this, gesture towards the fact that what we might have been measuring is more specific to our culture in terms of skill set, cognitive skill set, than we previously have phrased it or thought about.
Interesting. So should we create culturally specific measures of executive functioning, or do you believe that it's possible to create universal measures of executive functioning that work in schooled and unschooled groups?
I mean, here again, I think we're a little bit in 42 territory, in the sense that, or in Alice in Wonderland, where the Cheshire Cat goes like, where do you want to go? Like, it depends on it depends on what you want to do. So if our goal is to really find universal executive function, then we need to figure out a different way of measuring it in the US and the UK as well, I suspect, right? Or to show maybe look, I'm completely open to the fact that, well, not that open, but I am technically open to the fact that we could have done something completely wrong. Okay, then people need to show that school is not having an effect on the way that these tasks, what is going on in these tasks in the UK, US, whatever, in the industrialized schooled world. We need to figure if we want to find the universal, then we have to parse out what schooling is doing. We probably should make a theory of that somewhere along the line, parse it out of what's going on, and then try to drill down and figure out what might be common. This can be hard, right? So actual tasks in the world vary a lot, but it's not impossible. There's probably something you could do. The other question is, if we want stuff that's going to have an executive function flavor to it, but is going to predict real life performance, maybe we should use these standard tasks, right? So for instance, a lot of the kids in Namibia, for better or for worse, are being put into the rural schools, right? There's a movement in Namibia, they're trying to educate all the children, right? And this is the case in many countries. So these tasks may be important indicators of how ready a kid is to participate in school. Totally possible. In which case we should use those tasks, right? It depends on what you want to do with them. If you want to measure individual differences in executive function as applied to cattle herding, we have some really exciting task development ahead of us. I mean, I don't know how to do it, but that's the kind of thing you would have to do. So I would say that it just depends on what we want to do. I think my personal interests lie towards the cultural end of this, figuring out what local cultural environments demand and how we can measure that. But the Universalist program is absolutely an important one as well.
I do have to admit I'm more in favor of the universalist side, but you can't be a good universalist without understanding and being able to incorporate the culturalist piece. Because, and I've published an article, it's literally my very first sole author article, where I say culture is not just some patina on the surface of the mind, and if you can scrape it away, you can get to what you really want to measure. No, culture's fully enmeshed in every thought, every action. You definitely have to consider it, no matter how much of a universalist you may want to be.
Yeah.
Your study raises a lot of new questions, and so to close out, what do you think is the most important follow-up research question to answer?
I mean, I would like to say two broad ones. I mean, there are concrete stuff, but the concrete ones we'll leave for another time. I think in the general sense, I think it's important for us to understand what schooling is doing. Even if we're interested in the Universalist program, we have to factor it out, right? We just haven't. We have this, there's an intentional effort an incredible intentional effort to shape kids' minds all the time. And it's generally not factored out of what we describe as general cognitive development when we work with schooled samples. So we should figure out what schooling is doing, right? And this is going to build on 50 years of literature in the work in the cross-cultural literature. So I think that, and then incorporating it with the mainstream literature, possibly formal frameworks of the mind, this kind of thing, right? The other thing I think that is important is to, and scholars are thinking about this right now, is to think about the way in which executive functions, general capacities are being played out in specific contexts. So what are the worlds that kids are living in, right? To give us a little bit more detail, even the US, UK, Boston kids, what are their challenges? What does it mean to do executive function like in their surroundings? And what are the tasks? Why would their lives be related to performance on stuff like dimensional cards, or while potentially kids in 𝐶𝐄𝐏𝐈𝐒𝐒, non-schooled kids in 𝐶𝐄𝐏𝐈𝐒𝐒𝐒's lives might not be, right? So getting a better texture, getting data, getting environmental data, like observations, coded observations, like actually understanding what the world is like for these children. Those for me are the kind of two of the broad directions that I would be eager to pursue.
Well, excellent. Well, our time's up, but I appreciate you coming in, Ivan. Again, the article is called The Cultural Construction of Executive Function. It's published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it's fully open access so that anyone can read it. We just scratched the surface. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the article itself and in its supplemental files. Whether you're an IQ guy like me or an executive functioning person, or just interested in psychology in general, I think there's a lot of meat in there. I think anthropologists will find it interesting. And so I highly encourage everyone to check it out.
Great. Thank you, Russell.
Thank you for coming.